Thanks, Bobby. Hello, everyone. I thought I'd talk a little bit this afternoon about the digital revolution, something that probably a lot of people hear more about than they actually kind of know about, and its effects on the ABC and why it's made the ABC more crucial than it's ever been, and at the same time, in some ways, less visible. I joined the BBC in 1969. It was television. Sorry, are you hearing me all right? Oh, I need to. Television was a new medium in those days, a bit like the dot-com boom in the 2000s. Most of the people that worked there were very young. There was a popular, well, no, there was a book written about television at that time called The New Priesthood. And in a sense, I think that's what we felt we were. And the thing about priests is that they preach to the public. They don't get much feedback. You know, you're the one that knows what God's thinking. And you tell the public, and the public can kind of like it or lump it. And that's really what television and radio in those days was like. It was a one-way channel of communication. And of course, the chief priests were not us young strippers behind the camera, but the people in front of the camera, who were mostly older men, on some occasions rather younger and more beautiful women. But you had to be fairly young and fairly beautiful to make it onto television as a female in those days. Whereas as a bloke, you could be about as old and as ugly as you wanted, as long as you carried a bit of credibility. And things haven't changed all that much. They've changed a little bit. The biggest archist priest in Britain at the time that I joined television was a man called Richard Dimbleby, whose ponderous tones describing royal funerals and coronations and so on were much valued. In fact, there was supposed to be, I never actually saw it, a notice in the corridors of Broadcast House in London that said, "In case of fire, save Richard Dimbleby first." And that particular archpriesthood was a hereditary position. His son David presented Panorama and was probably one of the best known people in Britain at his time. His brother Jonathan was another celebrated broadcaster. So there were a lot of Dimbleby priests. But we had our own in Australia, of course, you know, people like George Negus, who I invited George to be the first presenter of Foreign Correspondent in the early 1990s, after he'd been on 60 Minutes for the best part of a decade and also presenting a Today program. He was probably the most famous person in Australia, I reckon, leaving Bob Hawke aside. He really was astonishing. Go anywhere in Australia, indeed most of the world, and people recognize George. But the Kerry O'Briens, the Ray Martins, these people, we used to talk about presenter's disease. And it's no aspersion on those guys, but it was very hard when you were doing those jobs not to feel that you were just vastly popular, because all the people that liked you could think of nothing better than to come up to you in public and say, "G'day, George, lovely to see you, can I have your autograph?" Didn't have selfies in those days, but because the people who didn't like you, I mean, we're a polite nation, and face to face anyway, you didn't come up and say, "Can't stand you." Little story about that. When I finally made it to being a presenter myself on Media Watch, I used to go swimming at an outside rock pool in Sydney called Wiley's Baths, and you had to pay. And the guy who took the money was a little bloke called Huey, who'd been there for ages and ages, and he always just never gave the slightest indication he knew or cared who I was or knew what I did, and that was fine. And one day I went in, there was a new bloke taking the money. Huey was still there, but kind of in the background. And this new bloke said, "Oh, Jonathan Holmes, I love Media Watch, my favorite program." So I said, "Oh, great. And I went to get changed, and I needed a 20-cent piece for the shower later. So I came back. I said, "Oh, by the way," he said, "I've been talking about it with Huey here. He doesn't think like I do. As a matter of fact, he can't stand you." Yeah, the thing is, this was 2008. That was kind of unusual then. to get that negative feedback. But it was on the cusp of change. iPhone came out in July of 2008. Twitter was just getting started. Mark Scott was really keen that we all presenters kind of get involved in Twitter and digital media, because he knew that was the future of the ABC. In fact, my first year at Media Watch ended with a special show, and there'd been a group on Twitter who'd been trying to get me to say the word, I don't even know how to pronounce it, PWN is a kind of digital word to meaning to beat somebody or to defeat them in a game. You pwned them. Don't know where it came from, but they wanted me to say pwned. And they said if I did say pwned, they'd do a nudie run around their house, around the block. Ignored it. And in the final show, I managed to work it into the script. And I did actually use the word pwned. And sure enough, about a dozen of them did nudie runs, and they tabulate on their phones, and they send in pictures of themselves trotting around the streets at night in the Starkers. Mark Scott was thrilled. He thought it was fantastic. This is what we need. But the point is that two-way traffic is fine when it's nice and friendly like that. But what, of course, more and more people discovered is that, and as Twitter in particular progressed or regressed, people like Lee Sales, people like Hamish MacDonald, found that the feedback to them was so poisonous that they could not stand staying on Twitter any longer. The negative feedback from people who were accusing, and mostly interestingly, on Twitter, these people came from the left of the spectrum, not the right. And they were accusing Lee of being some kind of lackey of the Morrison government, and Hamish MacDonald of being the same. And really, honestly, to anyone who knows them, it's just the most bizarre notion. But it was remorseless and relentless. But the point is that all communication these days is two-way, not one-way. And there were much more important consequences than the discomfiture of the Lee Saleses of this world. What has happened as a result of the digital revolution is that broadcast, timed media like television and radio are essentially dying, and in another decade will be dead. Nobody under the age of 40 much watches television at all, except sport. And if they really love it, sorry, what's the word? The real, of course, I've forgotten the term. All that endless stuff that we get on 9 and 7. Reality, thank you. Because you can vote. If you can vote on it, then you have to watch it live. And that means you have to watch the ads, and that's why they put so much of the television time into reality television. But basically, for most things, we don't watch broadcast television anymore. We don't watch, we even if we watch the news, we watch it on delay, or we watch it when we want to watch it, and we can spin through the ads and so on and so on. And that's drastically affected every broadcaster's business. They've got to think about, how do we find the audience away from television and radio? It's something the ABC is obsessed with. It's something that all the commercial channels are obsessed with. And of course, newspapers have had even bigger crisis to their business model, because they were totally, advertising was such an important part of their income. The news never makes money. News has never made money in the history of news. It's the advertising surrounding it that makes the money. And in a sense, there were always papers like the Trading Post that didn't bother with any content other than advertising. But when you got websites like Seek and Car and all of the others that could very cheaply and very efficiently advertise all the jobs and the car sale and the houses for sale, those massive classified ads from the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age just were useless as revenue earners. So newspapers are in a huge crisis, but that's coming to broadcast television too. But there's the other thing that's happened though is that broadcast television has now got the rival of streaming services. Now these are massively wealthy international organizations that can globalize an audience. You know, Game of Thrones is able for, you know, your $10 a week, you can get a program that costs $100 million for 10 or 12 episodes because there's such a huge global audience. So The Crown, I think, was at the time, the most expensive program ever made. Now we've got House of Dragon and the new sequel to Lord of the Rings are massively expensive. My son is a production designer for movies and normally works for Australian movies, which don't have very big budgets. He's designing a 6-part series set in 1980s New York, but actually being shot in Budapest in Hungary because it's cheaper. But even so, the budget for that television series, which is a British production, but it's for Netflix, is £7 million an hour, $11 million an hour. Now, we used to think $1 million an hour was a massive amount of money in television in Australia. So the ABC and every other, I mean, basically commercial television has given up drama. It cannot afford it. It can't afford to do it at you know, anything comparable standard to what you're seeing coming in on the streaming services. The ABC is struggling too. I still think its drama's pretty good, but there's only 30 hours of it a year. David Hill's days, you know, there was a much panoply about it being 100 hours a year. So, you know, these are real challenges. I think that the streaming services have now manufactured their own problem, which is that there's so many of them now that the competition is becoming greater and greater. The audiences are fragmenting, and so the amount of money they can spend on each series is actually going to diminish, not increase. And we're going to see something much more similar to the very competitive situation that was in broadcast television before the advent of streaming. However, that's another story. The other really important consequence, though, of the digital age, which I'm sure you're all kind of conscious of the notion, is siloing, is the fact that because we now can curate our own, what we listen to and what we view to a far greater extent than we ever used to be able to, we choose to watch what we agree with. And what that means is we much less often than we used to do we hear the opposing point of view on anything. If we don't happen to think that climate change is a real thing and we think it's a hoax, we can find enough people to agree with us on the websites and on Fox News, or Sky News or wherever, to be perfectly happy with that our view is right and everybody else is wrong. And we're never tempted to, you know, even kind of really listen to the other side. And that goes for all kinds of stuff. Now, Rupert Murdoch actually is really bad at in the digital era. He's made an awful lot of mistakes, doesn't really understand it. MySpace was a disaster. He started to do a digital newspaper, didn't work. But he's always understood that the way to make money in communications is not to try to appeal to everybody. It's to carve out your segment. He did this first brilliantly in Britain with The Sun in the late 1960s. Rupert Murdoch understood before anybody else that there was a large working class conservative audience that was unsatisfied with anything that was being offered to them, socially conservative and working class. And that was the audience that The Sun absolutely unerringly targeted and made a fortune for Murdoch. He tried to do it again in America, and for ages he couldn't do it because people don't go, in Britain, people went to work in public transport and they bought The Sun from the newsstand. Nobody does that in America. They drive to work and you get your newspaper delivered on the lawn by the paper boy. And the tabloids don't work that way. So Murdoch, he was very frustrated. He could do it in New York, but nowhere else. And then he discovered cable television in the 1990s. Cable television gave you the chance to aim for that niche audience. And that's what he did. And he made another fortune, a much bigger fortune with Fox News. And what's Fox News' philosophy? It is to divide, not to unite. Because the more you divide, the more solid your audience gets. And what Fox News has done ever since the evil genius, Roger Ailes, took it over, or started running it in 95, 96, is to say to people, everything they're telling you, the mainstream media is fake news, it's nonsense, they're biased to the left, they're propagandists, we're the ones that are telling you the truth. It has worked astonishingly well, and it's been magnified by that siloing of the social media that makes it even more. I mean, not all those people who watch Fox News also have a bunch of resources that they can go to on the web. And the result has been this bitter division in the United States, which is really frightening, and which has led, among other things, I'm not saying, thank you, Lachlan, that he's a co-conspirator, but Fox News has been certainly one of the elements that led to that January the 6th riot. Because people don't have, I mean, too many Americans have no faith in their own democracy anymore. And this is going to go on. It's going to go on the next election and the one after that. Now, public broadcasting is one way of countering this threat. They don't have it in the United States to speak of. I mean, they have PBS, but it's got tiny audiences and very little money. It's no coincidence that the Murdoch media have always hated the public broadcasters, the BBC especially, and the ABC to a great degree as well, because they are trying to broadcast to everybody with a broad spectrum of views and opinions, and to unite the country thereby. And what Rupert wants to do is to divide it. And anyway, these days in Australia, he's only got two rivals. He's got 9 newspapers and television and the ABC. And he would dearly love to get rid of both of them. But as long as there's a coalition government in hand, in power, he's got a very good chance of killing the ABC by 1,000 cuts. So that's an issue. But you know, there's another one that keeps ABC managers awake at night far more than the threat of Rupert Murdoch. It's simply, how do you maintain the ABC's identity in an age when nobody much cares where they get their news from? See, most of us came from an era when you wanted to watch the ABC, you turned to Channel 2 on the television. Or you wanted to listen to Perth radio, you went to 7:20 AM on the radio dial. That's where the ABC was. Young people don't watch television and listen to radio in that way at all. They absorb stuff through their mobiles, and very often they don't really know where it came from. Like the ABC likes to say it's #1 on Apple News. It is #1 on Apple News. But how many users of Apple News actually know where the stories that they're looking at have come from or care? The answer is possibly not very many of them. How many listeners to Triple J, which is the great bastion of the only way that the ABC reaches a lot of people in their teens and 20s in this country, how many people realize Triple J is part of the ABC? Well, a lot of them don't, because Triple J takes good care actually to make sure that not too many of their listeners do know. You know, it thinks the ABC is a kind of badge for oldies. But we've got all these podcasts. I mean, the ABC has been very good in the digital age. It led the way with iView. It led the way with podcasts. Radio National invented the podcast virtually in this country. Its audience is now, in terms of reach, it reckons it's reaching nearly 70% of the population once a week with something. Now, that is massively bigger than any proportion that it used to reach in the analog age. So it's successful enough, but it needs to be identifiable. If people don't know that what they're consuming is from the ABC, they're not going to be telling the government that they want the ABC to survive and flourish. And so the people that we need to be sitting in this room, as well as You great people are all those people in their 20s and 30s. Now, they've never watched the ABC much, to be honest, that age group, but they have come back to us. They used to listen to, Play School, and then they would go away and have their kids, and they'd watch it when their kids were watching Play School, and they'd go and come back to the ABC in their 40s. That may not be happening anymore because so many younger people just don't have a habit of even thinking about whether I'm listening or watching the ABC. And then I think, I don't know what the answer is. I mean, the ABC tries to make sure, this is an ABC podcast, ding, 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 if you're listening to one. But I don't know how they're going to solve that problem, but it is the problem, really, for the survival of the ABC. And so I would urge you, if you've got children or grandchildren of the appropriate age, just say to them, do you realize, what the ABC does? And try to get them to value it, because we desperately need that to happen. And I think I'm going to leave it there, Bobby. But I'm happy to take any questions anyone has. Yeah. Is that a pigeon?
Just because I'm often in the position lately, because I've taken on these Twittery people, to say what the ABC does, can you give me just a little paragraph that I could respond with? What does the ABC do?
I don't have one written in my head, although I probably should.
But a draft is fine.
I would say to them that the ABC is the place you go to find Australia. Australian stories, Australian news that is true, discussion about Australian matters that matter. And less can anyone else do that. And ask them to think about how much they read and listen to about Australia that, I mean, of course, there's heaps and heaps of little podcasts and people on the web, comedians, all sorts of things. I'm not saying it's exclusive, but that is the ABC's core function, and it always will be. And I think it's getting rarer and rarer. I'm best off the top of my head.
Thank you. I actually found that really beautiful, and I hope it's recorded. I'm going to get that down verbatim and use it.
Just wait for the mic.
Sorry. It's a little bit unrelated, but a very important point that I noticed around the last election in Western Australia, the last 24 hours, there were ads running constantly against all rules and regulations for the Liberal Party. And I wrote a pile of letters and made calls because I was so disgusted. Apparently what it is, and most young people watch all stream from their devices. They don't watch TV, exactly. Either do I. I'm a touring jazz musician. I stream. They run, I don't watch networks, TV stations at all, but I sometimes have to watch just to see what's going on. So many ads, but they were running these ads, and when I reported it, they said there's no rules and regulations on what we can do running political ads in Australia, streaming devices. So the rules and regulations for political ads only applies to TV and not streaming. So I thought that was the most frightening thing to hear, that they actually were running them right up to on election day in Western Australia. So it's just another thing to be aware of, is that if so many young people are only watching those programs streaming on their devices, they were getting all those ads.
I think that's right. ACMA doesn't have any regulatory power over cyberspace. It does, actually, that's not quite true. I think it can it has some authority over things like child pornography and stuff like that, but it can't regulate online activity the way it can broadcast activity. But I do believe the government is going to move to bring in more regulation about political advertising, at least. I think.
7 and Channel 9. So it was actually streaming from those
Yeah. But that's what I'm saying. If they're doing it online, ACMA's got no authority over it. Yeah.
Just Media Watch is such an important, sorry, over here.
Can't see you.
Yes,
there you are.
Jonathan.
Right.
Media Watch is such an important balancing program against a lot of what you've talked about. And I'm sure you've got many stories about times where you've been threatened and the ABC's been threatened with legal action. As we know, there have been many. But the future of programs like that, I'd like your opinion on that.
Well, Media Watch is actually a pretty safe product, I think, in the sense that I don't see them. It's wonderful for downloading. It's 15 minutes long. You can download it quite quickly. You can watch it on the bus, on your mobile. It was one of the most popular programs early on in the digital era amongst downloaders and vodcast watchers because it was so short and punchy. And it still rates pretty well. I don't think it's in any particular danger. I don't have any particular recollection of being threatened. At the time when I was presenting Media Watch, the editor-in-chief of The Australian, a man called Chris Mitchell, inordinately, how shall I say, pleased with himself individual. And he really reacted to criticism in a way that was quite out of proportion. It was kind of weird. He would write, whole editorials attacking Media Watch in The Australian, in the national newspaper. And you're going, hang on, the Daily Telegraph or the Herald Sun or the other news tabloids, they either ignore you completely or they just kind of bat you away. And that's the way I would do it if I was one of them. But Chris would have taken it so seriously and fulminate, and I have little pictures of myself in an editorial, which is kind of unusual. You don't even do that with prime ministers, and they're still doing that to Paul Barry, although they don't do it at quite such length because I think Chris Dorr has got a tabloid training and his sentences are shorter, but the feeling is the same, and that just comes with the job, and is one of the pleasures of doing that job is that you are allowed. Really the only bit of the ABC that's allowed to hit back a bit. No.
Have you ever thought about how to break down the siloing? I've got friends who I just don't talk to about particular subjects.
It's a conundrum, isn't it? And the answer is no. I don't know. And many more wiser people than I have had a go at thinking of ways of solving it. As I say, it's up to individuals now. Television in the United States was the great leveler for a long, long time. Everybody watched the ABC News, American ABC or CBS News every evening, and there were these kind of guru presenters, and they thought at the time that they were completely impartial, whether they've now been portrayed as being always hopelessly left-wing, but it's that perception that, as I say, has produced this tremendous division, just as it was their influence, I think, that produced the unity of the United States. Of course, it was highly divided in the 1960s and 70s too. I'm not saying it wasn't, but the essential belief in those core American values about democracy and things wasn't really questioned in a way it is now. But no, I don't have an answer. I think it's fortunately true that Murdoch's audience is largely old, white, and dying slowly, and that younger people don't listen much to that. But then there's an awful lot of other stuff out there that they do listen to, some of them. So I don't know. I worry about it. Sorry, not very helpful.
Yes. Sorry.
The lady at the back?
Yes. Sorry.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah. No, a quick one here, and it's even though you did say in the introduction that it's digital that we're discussing today, I just wanted to follow up on what this lady behind me was saying about regulations.
Yeah.
Thing that irks me when it's election time, even though we know the majority of people are not buying Murdoch or newspapers in the quantities that they're used to. Just wonder why it is that Coles and Woolworths, the supermarkets, have stacks and stacks of newspapers sitting there. People right near all the checkouts. People, you can't help but read all the headlines. You don't have to buy the newspaper, and it's literally lies and baloney and bullshit about Labor all the way through. And people don't, as I say, they don't have to buy a newspaper. It's just they might as well just have they're polling at the market.
Well, look, I don't think we can tell Coles that it can't display the Daily Telegraph or
No,
whatever.
but they're all Murdoch
I mean,
papers.
you're fortunate in WA that you don't have the equivalent Murdoch tabloids. I don't think the West Australian is, for all its faults, anything like.
No, it's not as
yeah.
bad here as over east. That's
But
right. I know there's no.
let me just say this because it's a point I like to make. We're always being told that the ABC, unlike commercial media, is constrained by law to being objective and impartial. Now, actually, what the ABC Act says is that the board's responsibility is to ensure that the ABC's news and information programs are accurate and impartial according to the recognized standards of objective journalism. In other words, what it's saying is the ABC should be just like everybody else. That all media should recognize the standards of objective journalism. The problem we have in this country is that Rupert Murdoch never, ever has. He thinks that's baloney. Objective journalism is journalism that doesn't sell. He's got no interest in it and never has. So, there's this bizarre situation where the ABC is being continuously criticized by the Murdoch media for not living up to its charter when it makes no pretense whatsoever of living up to what should be the overall ethics of responsible journalism everywhere. Of course, it says it does, but I mean, it knows it doesn't. So, but at the same time, I don't think we can go down the route of, banning or over-regulating newspapers. It is a free country; it has to remain one. And I'm not in favor of more state regulation of the content of anything than we have now.
I'd like to comment about what you were saying on elections. When we have an election, because of the 3-hour time difference in summertime, we get pundits over east telling us what's going to happen, and we're still got for another 3 hours. The polling booths are still open. So it's not just on the internet that this is coming in; it's coming in from broadcasters as well. The other thing I wanted to ask about was the closing of Radio Australia. The stuff that's going on in Bougainville at the moment. Australia, the only thing that Radio Australia can do now is they've got 13 very low-powered FM transmitters and a few islands. So Australia's point of view is not getting to the people. That's all I want to say.
Yeah, look, I'm no expert on the international aspects. I don't know how many people use the wave. Very hard to estimate. When you say they're closing down Radio Australia, I take it you mean they're closing down the shortwave service. Yeah. Look, it was a decision that was taken by the ABC rather than by the government, even though it was taken as a result of funding cuts by the government. And there's a technical battle going on about whether it's better to spend the money to reach people, through their mobile phones wherever they are, through digital product of one sort or another, or whether to go back to the old shortwave stations, which I think the Chinese have taken over to a great extent anyway. I'm sure you're right. I'm sure it is important that we reach those places. And I think there will be more done, thanks to the Albanese government has put another $8 million into ABC International, which will be used partly to increase the output. But yeah, that's a problem. Now, your other question was, well, look, fact is, this is a very large country with 3 time zones. I don't know that there's an answer to that. I mean, you can't impose a sort of blackout on news in the eastern states for 3 hours while we wait while these West Australian votes. I just don't see that there's an easy answer to that. And equally, you can't impose a blackout on Western Australians not being able to receive a signal from the east for 3 hours. So, yeah, I mean, you know, I just think that's a fact of life. And luckily, you're all highly independent people in WA. You do your own thing and you don't pay any attention to what we do in the east.
You're quite right. I have a question from one of our online people, Moira, and she asks, is it right to say the ABC represents thinking Australians and promotes conversation?
I'm sure that that the ABC would like to think so. And certainly, as we know, Radio National's motto, 17 million times a day, think bigger. So, yes, but you know, again, I don't think it's job only to represent thinking Australians in the sense of just the sort of intellectual elite. I think it does and should try to reach in its different ways all kinds of Australians in different, you know, whether it's through music or whether it's through drama or whether it's through comedy or whatever. But certainly it should be the place to go if you are a thinking Australian.
I'd like to ask just about comedy. Have you met Sean McAuliffe or Sammy J? And the other little thing I'd like to say is that I love the way the ABC asks questions. And there's a few women who've fallen because of that. Emma Alberici, although they've probably gone on to better things. Yasmin Abdul-Majid, other women on Four Corners. People who ask too many questions get into trouble. Only from the black and white thinking, not from the ABC. But anyway, back to the funny bits. This saves my life. And now Sean McAuliffe's gone. Sammy J is still there. And also the Media Bites. That's great too with Paul
Barry.
Paul Barry. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, well, I'm glad you like Media Bites. Yeah, Paul's a good friend of mine. I see him a lot. The other two, alas, no, I actually don't think I have ever met either of them in person. But you know, it doesn't really matter whether I met them or not. They're very enjoyable programs. What was the other thing you were talking about?
Asking too many questions.
Yeah, well,
and,
you know, Emma
being
Alberici
driven
was
out.
in fact, she wrote something that Malcolm Turnbull hated, and he conveyed that to his good friend who happened to be the chairman of the ABC. And Justin Milne conveyed it to Michelle Guthrie, who was the managing director, get rid of her. Now, that was because Justin was obsessed with getting hundreds of millions of dollars from the government for this huge project he had of totally digitizing the ABC in ways that most other people couldn't quite fathom what he was on about. But anyway, he was, you know, he thought like a businessman. He said to himself, we cannot keep upsetting our major stakeholder, a major source of funds. We need this money to survive. And that's more important than Emma Alberici. That was his way of thinking. Of course, you can't do that as the chairman of a public broadcaster. You cannot think it's our job to keep our funders happy. It's the way, you know, and Michelle Guthrie made sure that he lasted about 3 days longer than she did. It was an extraordinary episode in the ABC's history. It wasn't only, I don't think it was because Emma is a woman. I mean, another target of Justin was Andrew Probyn, the political editor, because, well, he did stay, but Emma, oh, look, it's a very complicated saga. And I really can't talk about it further because Well, no, it's just that I don't, you know, I don't want to say things about colleagues that may or may not be true. And I just think that there was a bit more to that than met the eye. I mean, I think that her piece, the one that so infuriated Turnbull, was a perfectly justified piece of journalism. It did have a couple of mistakes in it, and it was a bit opinionated. And that's an area in the ABC that's very complicated these days. When you have online so-called analysis at several thousand words, now this is something the ABC's never done before. The ABC used to do radio and television. It used to have interviews with short interspersed by short things from reporters. You never had great monologues from reporters about giving an analysis of a major topic. In the digital world, that's what the senior reporters do. But it's extremely complicated to divide what's opinion from what's analysis. And there's and in the ABC's opinion, after admittedly in reaction to this attack by Turnbull, was that that so-called analysis was too opinionated, and so they took it down and they changed it a bit, and then they put it back up. But the row between Emma and the then news director Gavin Morris was intense and bitter, and I think was as much to do with personality as with anything else. So look, I can't really comment further. All I'm saying is I'm not sure that her being a woman was particularly relevant. I think it is an example, though, of where, if you like, I think you're probably right, that political pressure did achieve what it was setting out to achieve in the end.